Hi, welcome to the ProLiteracy blogcast, episode 1. My name is Kevin Morgan. I'm the president and CEO of ProLiteracy. Our guest today is Stephen Reeder. He is Professor Emeritus of Applied Linguistics at Portland State University. He is the author of numerous publications on adult literacy, second language acquisition, and digital literacy. He served as principal investigator for numerous large research projects on adult literacy development, second language acquisition, digital literacy, and lifelong learning. Steve is also a former ProLiteracy board member. Steve, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you for having me, Kevin.
Our pleasure. Well, we'll jump right in, Steve. The data from the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies indicates that over 40 million U.S. adults have low reading and numeracy skills. And as you and I have talked about in the past, that number really has not changed significantly in recent years. You recently wrote an article for the spring 2020 issue of Adult Literacy Education, the International Journal of Literacy, Language, and Numeracy, around broadening the lens on adult literacy education outcomes. What got you interested in this topic, Steve?
Well, it's been watching the gradual vocationalization of adult literacy over recent decades, while those very numbers you're talking about haven't really been going down. And that led me to think that seeing adult education only as part of a job training system is just too narrow an approach.
You mention in your article the neoliberal framework in adult education. What is the definition of neoliberal framework, and what's the history and the role that it's played in adult education?
Well, that's a great question, Kevin. I think over the years, people have used that terminology, neoliberal, in different ways. How I've understood it is it's really the dominant economic framework we've had in Western and industrialized countries over the last 40 years or so. It emphasizes market-based solutions to a wide range of problems. In adult education, it's really emphasized market-based solutions to literacy training rather than seeing literacy as a human right, which is what brought me into the field many years ago.
When you were a young man.
Yes.
You cite public funding like WIOA as being heavily influenced by a neoliberal framework. One of the critiques of WIOA is that it largely leaves out the lowest level adult students. Why is that?
Well, I think one reason for that is what we were just talking about, the sort of market view of literacy training, which just sort of prices some people out of access. It's just too expensive to train for whatever purposes industry may have or whatever jobs they may need at a given time. But there's another factor as well, which is racism is really not addressed in a market-based system when there are structural barriers that interfere with its operation, as we know. So together, I think those two things have really pushed a lot of learners aside.
And, you know, social impact is often defined as the effect on people and communities that happens because of an action or inaction, project, program, or policy. In the case of adult literacy education, I thought it was quite fascinating. In your article, you indicated social impact can take years or even a generation.
Yeah, it really can. I was involved with a longitudinal study of adult learners in Portland a number of years ago. And in that study, we found it really took about 5 years for programs to have their full impact on skill development and earnings growth compared to similar people who did not go through the program. That was also the case for the impact of the GED. It just sometimes takes quite a while for impacts to fully, develop and fall into place.
Yeah, your longitudinal study can actually be found in an overview of it can be found on the ProLiteracy website under research white papers. And I recall that, it showed tremendous impact when students had a minimum of 100 hours
Right.
of instruction. Okay, so next question. In the article, you advocate for lifelong and life-wide framework for adult literacy education. How would that framework be different or similar to the current neoliberal framework?
Probably in two main ways. First of all, I think the set of outcomes that would be counted for evaluation and funding purposes would be much broader than the current set of outcomes. Might include things like measures of well-being, such as overall health, a feeling of having some voice in public affairs, perhaps different measures of civic engagement. I think there's a wide range of outcomes that literacy has impact on that aren't recognized in those programs, in currently funded public programs. But there's also the need for a longer time period for evaluating programs and designing programs, as we were saying a moment ago. So I think this lifelong, life-wide framework would be both broader in substance and longer in time period.
Do you think funders, both public and private, will have the patience to wait for longer-term outcomes on adult education?
I think they will if we can present it persuasively. After all, they have a lot of patience for the economic outcomes of K-12 education, which often take 15, 20 years to develop, right? So why not also have that type of patience for the impact of adult education? And I think what we need to do is to really start bringing about, a discourse of lifelong learning, not as an exception, but as the norm, in which long-term outcomes and benefits of education, of adult education, would be the normal way of thinking about it, instead of just having an immediate focus on next quarter's impact and next quarter's bottom line.
Yeah, even the term social impact implies some immediacy to it, but
Right.
Sometimes the results can take time.
And a lot of times, those longer term outcomes can be multi-generational, as we know.
Absolutely.
For literacy, it's not only the adults who are benefiting, but their children who benefit as well.
Well, we mentioned your longitudinal study on adult learning that tracked 1,000 participants. You did this over a 10-year period. It had 6 interview periods, as I recall. Has the development of smartphones and technology made it easier today to conduct, longer-term outcomes on adult education?
I think it really could make certain kinds of studies and evaluations much easier to do over long time periods. It's very difficult and very expensive, especially for marginally funded programs, to actually go in and do household interviews periodically with a large number of students who go through programs. That's what we did in the longitudinal study. But I think that now, with the advent of smartphones and people being used to getting text messages as reminders to do things, that it really could be done quite easily, following people over periods of time with their permission, of course.
Sure.
So let's do it.
I agree. Let's see. Last question. Once you read this article, and it's quite fascinating to read, what do you think are the logical next steps to pursue a process and funding of lifelong and life-wide framework for adult education?
Well, I think some of the things we've already talked about are a good starting point. That is, having a broader set of outcomes that individuals and communities develop for themselves. I think having longer time periods for seeing what the impacts are and cycling feedback into programs for improvement purposes would be very, very helpful as well. And I think our experience in the last few months with the pandemic and the heightened awareness of racial injustice and poverty in our society really prompt us to consider those issues as we think about the future of adult literacy education. And I think we need to think about some creative new ways to incentivize and fund a broader array of programs and providers.
Well, I agree with that, Steve. We appreciate you joining us today. And if you would like to read Steve's article we discussed, it's titled A Lifelong and Life-Wide Framework for Adult Literacy Education. You can visit proliteracy.org/research, where you can not only find Steve's article, but also the current issue of Adult Literacy Education, the International Journal of Literacy, Language, and Numeracy. For ProLiteracy, I am Kevin Morgan.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.